Senate Committee on Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs will come to order. This hearing is in the virtual format. A few reminders as you begin. Once you start speaking, there'll be a slight delay before you're on the screen. To minimize background noise, please click the mute button until it is your turn to speak or ask questions. You should all have one box on your screens labeled clock that will show time remaining. For witnesses, you'll have 5 minutes for opening statements. For senators, 5-minute clock still applies for your questions. At 30 seconds remaining, you'll hear a bell ring to remind you your time's almost expired, ringing again when your time has expired. If there's a technology issue, we'll move to the next witness or senator until it's resolved. To simplify the speaking order process, Senator Toomey and I have agreed to go by seniority for this hearing. As most of my Senate colleagues on this committee know, Thursday will be our first in-person hearing in more than a year, the first I've had the privilege to chair. I know that all of us, especially since the average age of a senator is higher than the average age of a typical American citizen, we know we've all learned a lot about technology. Some of us slower learners than others over the last 15 months. Today, we're joined by local leaders who represent a cross section of this country. Whether it's an old industrial city or a college town, whether it's Indian country or Appalachia, local leaders understand how proud people are of their hometowns. They want their town to be successful. They want their communities to grow and attract jobs. They don't want families to be told to pick up and leave to find opportunity. They don't want to lose workers forced out by rising housing costs. Mayors also know the many opportunities we can unleash if we make the once-in-a-generation investment to rebuild our country's infrastructure. They know what their communities need. They know the transit project that would revitalize a neglected neighborhood and bring new residents and customers to Main Street. They know where there are shovel-ready projects that would build new houses that workers can actually afford. They know where lead pipes and lead paint still poison kids in America in the year 2021. They know the building trades workers that are ready to get to work, replacing those water lines, retrofitting those homes. Mayors understand how all these pieces fit together. Jobs and infrastructure are inseparable. You can't create the former without the latter. We know when a business decides where to build a new plant or office, they look at the infrastructure. They want to know if there's broadband, if there are homes that workers can afford, if there's a bus or a train that runs nearby. When a young family decides whether to relocate for a new job, they think about how they'll get to work, how long will the commute be, whether their whole paycheck will get eaten up by rent or the mortgage. These issues intersect, and while they may look different in Bozeman and Akron and Tempe or Lancaster, we know they are national problems. Mayors and city councils and county commissioners can do a lot of good, but they can't do it all on their own. When we electrified the country in the beginning but not ending in the 1930s, and Senator Tester's book, I read that in the 40s they were still electrifying parts of Montana. From the plains to Appalachia to the deep south as we electrified, we didn't ask each individual mayor to come up with her own grid or build his own dam. When we built the interstate highway system, we didn't expect every county in central Pennsylvania or southeast Ohio to foot the bill for its stretch of road. We became the world's largest economy with the strongest middle class because we came together to invest in great national projects that joined us all together as one country. We didn't force workers and their families to foot the bill. The corporations that rely on our public goods to make their vast growing profits should contribute to that upkeep. Stock buybacks climb, corporate profits soar. Yet America's states and cities from Akron to Bozeman to Tempe, America's states and cities and towns scrape by each year making hard choices about their budgets. They don't want to shortchange public safety, so they wait another year to replace aging buses. They don't want to cut teachers' salary and lose talent, so there's no money to turn dilapidated properties into affordable homes in my Slavic Village neighborhood in Cleveland. Over and over, I hear the same thing from leaders in places large and small, rural and urban. To attract good jobs, we need more resources. We need homes that workers can afford and ways for them to get to work. Today, we'll hear from my longtime friend, Mayor Dan Horgan from Akron, a proud Midwestern city that's endured decades of a national tax and trade policy that encouraged its businesses to shut down production in Akron, in the Goodyear neighborhood of Firestone Park in Akron, and move good paying union jobs abroad where companies can pay lower wages and exploit workers. That outsourcing doesn't just affect individual workers and their families in Akron, as Mayor Horgan will tell you. It erodes the tax base, making it that much harder for cities like Akron to build the infrastructure that would draw in new investment. We'll hear from Tempe, Arizona Mayor Corey Woods, who's working with a fast-growing city working to tackle their affordable housing shortage, showing the country how new transit innovation isn't just for New York and Philadelphia and Washington. It's not just for big coastal cities. That investment has the potential to spur growth in Sunbelt cities and across the country. We'll hear from Mayor Cindy Andrus of Bozeman. She'll tell you that high housing prices aren't just a problem in wealthy neighborhoods in big cities. Her fast-growing city's housing shortage, as young people move there, as the university thrives, and as people from the coast are relocating there, that it's driving up home prices and leaving families without options. All these mayors, the local leaders I talked to in Ohio, from Mansfield to Lima to Cleveland to Cincinnati, will tell you they've tried to make it on their own because they have to, not because they want to, not because they don't need investment. They want to be part of a broad national project. They want to build thriving, equitable, resilient communities. It's time for all of our communities and the workers and the families that call them home to share in our country's prosperity. It in part begins with our doing our job in Washington and extending that helping hand to these great cities across our country. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses, especially my fellow Pennsylvanian Josh Parsons from Lancaster County. At our last hearing about infrastructure, which was about a month ago, I noted that a group of my Republican colleagues and I had a constructive discussion with President Biden about a potential bipartisan infrastructure package. I also noted 3 features of an infrastructure package that I think would have very broad bipartisan support. First, it should responsibly support real physical infrastructure. That is, the platforms and systems that we share and we use to move people's goods and services throughout the economy. It means things like roads and bridges and ports and airports. Second, a package cannot undo the 2017 tax reform that helped create the best economy of my lifetime. Remember, before COVID, we were experiencing an extraordinary economic boom. We had the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. We had more job openings than people looking for jobs. We had a record low poverty rate and wage growth across the board, with wages growing fastest for the lowest income earners. That's exactly the economy we should all be wanting to get back to. And thirdly, we shouldn't pay for infrastructure by borrowing or printing billions of additional dollars. Now, good news in this is we have hundreds of billions of unspent COVID funds that Congress can repurpose. According to the Congressional Budget Office, over $700 billion of the Democrats' March spending bill won't be spent until after 2021. Now, unfortunately, the Biden administration wouldn't agree to these sensible features, and they walked away from negotiating with some of us. But I understand that there are bipartisan discussions underway. My hope is that an agreement can be reached that's consistent with these principles. But the scope and size of the administration's infrastructure plan as proposed at this point is simply untenable. I mean, take the scope of the plan. The administration wants to redefine what infrastructure means in order to spend taxpayer dollars on their Green New Deal agenda and other liberal policies. Consider some specific examples. The administration proposed almost $250 billion for housing. Now, set aside whether it's the responsibility of taxpayers to buy and build everyone a home, housing is not infrastructure. Housing is housing. The administration also proposed $100 billion in consumer rebates to purchase electric vehicles and $10 billion for the Civilian Climate Corps. This is not infrastructure. In addition to that, the $2.2 trillion size of the Biden administration plan is wildly excessive. Even the planned spending on the real physical infrastructure portion does not comport with economic reality, given how much money Congress has spent over the past year already. Take transit spending, for example. The administration wants $85 billion of additional money over the next 5 years, above and beyond what we would ordinarily spend over the next 5 years. Well, this doesn't take into account the tens of billions of dollars the federal government already provided for transit recently. This past March, our Democrat colleagues passed a bill spending $30 billion on transit. They did that after Congress provided more than $40 billion for transit in response to COVID in 2020. CBO estimates that of this $70 billion, $22 billion, almost a third of COVID transit dollars, won't be spent until after 2021. Oh, and the $70 billion, that was on top of the $13 billion we annually spend. So if you didn't have your calculator out, that's a total of $83 billion that Congress spent on transit over the course of 1 year. Amazingly enough, that number exceeds both the annual operating and capital costs of every single transit agency in the U.S. combined. And now they want $85 billion more over the next 5 years on top of what we ordinarily spend. The administration seems to have lost sight of the fact that the federal role in infrastructure spending has historically been limited. State and local governments are primarily responsible for funding infrastructure projects for the obvious reason that most infrastructure projects are generally local or regional in nature. For example, a bus or a light rail station in San Francisco doesn't really do a lot for people in Pittsburgh. And states and local governments are currently awash with cash. In the aggregate, state and local tax collections set an all-time record in 2020. And in addition to record revenues over the course of 12 months, Congress sent more than $850 billion to state and local governments. So states are now trying to figure out ways to spend this huge windfall. California has a budget surplus of over $75 billion. And at this point, they just may send out free money to Californians. My home state of Pennsylvania is sitting on $3 billion revenue surplus, plus $7 billion in unused federal money. So still more wasteful spending by Congress is not what our economy needs. It's already contributed to the harmful inflation Americans are experiencing right now. Inflation's at 5% right now, the highest it's been in 13 years, and this should not come as a surprise. Earlier this year, President Clinton's Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was warning us of the significant inflationary risks of the excessive spending, and that was before our Democratic colleagues passed the $1.9 trillion spending bill in March. But his warning was ignored, and now our Democratic colleagues want to spend hundreds of billions, maybe over $1 trillion more. Congress still has an opportunity to enact a sensible bipartisan infrastructure package, but that's only possible if we support real physical infrastructure that we pay for with existing funds without raising taxes or borrowing tens or hundreds of billions more. We can meet our country's infrastructure needs without jeopardizing our economic recovery and putting future generations of Americans further in debt. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Toomey. I'll introduce our first witness, Daniel Horgens, the mayor of Akron. He previously served as the Summit County Clerk of Courts, as an Akron City Council member, as a teacher at St. Vincent St. Mary, LeBron James alma mater, I might add, and at Stowe Monroe Falls High School. Mayor Horgan, thank you for being here today and representing a legacy city from America's heartland. I'll turn to my colleague, Senator Tester, to introduce the witness from his state. John.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Brown, and I want to thank you both for your opening statements. I just want to say a couple things before I get to Cindy Andrus, the mayor of Bozeman, Montana. Nobody likes wasteful spending, and I will tell you that if you really believe the pacing threat to this country is China, then we better get serious about infrastructure. The bottom line is that if you don't have places for people to live, you don't have a manufacturing base. You don't have the ability for business to expand. You don't have the ability for people to recruit. Cindy Andrus will probably tell you that in Bozeman, Montana, there's no such thing as a first-time home buyer because, quite frankly, the cost of homes is so damn high. Now, so I think we need to make an expenditure, a serious expenditure, or let's just turn the keys over to G, okay? Just let him do it. The fact of the matter is we need to step up. We need to do something that's meaningful, and housing and transit is the right way to do it. And we need to have a debate. If the money is wasteful spending, count me in. We'll pare it down. But the bottom line is the needs are huge across this country because we've been living on my grandparents' and my parents' investment in infrastructure, and I'm not exactly young anymore. As far as Cindy Andrus goes, it's a pleasure to have her in front of the committee today. She is an incredible leader in the state of Montana. She has been on the city council of Bozeman since 2010, and she has served as mayor of Bozeman for the last 2-3 years. Nod your head, Cindy, if that's right. The fact is that she's been a great leader for the Bozeman region, which is, by the way, one of the highest, fastest growing areas in our state. She has worked in the tourism industry for over 25 years. And we all know how important tourism is and the outdoor economy is for our great state of Montana. And she also serves on the board of directors for the National League of Cities and Towns. She is also the past chair of the Montana Tourism Advisory Council. As mayor, when I visited with her about her willingness to participate in this hearing, she pointed out that housing is an incredibly complex yet critical challenge in rapidly growing Bozeman, as it is, by the way, in other areas across this country. And so to address this and other infrastructure challenges, it is important that we hear from people like Cindy Andrus and other local officials on the ground about what's working and what isn't working. Both those are critically important. I look forward to this hearing, and I want to thank you, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey, for having this hearing. And welcome, Cindy Andrus.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Senator Sinema will introduce the mayor of Tempe. Senator Sinema.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. I am pleased to introduce my friend, the Honorable Corey Woods, who serves as the mayor of Tempe, Arizona. He's also the chief of staff at ASU Preparatory Academy. Mayor Woods served as a council member for the city of Tempe from 2008 to 2016. He earned his BA from the University of Michigan and his MA from Arizona State University's Mary Lou Fulton College of Education. The city of Tempe has prioritized a multimodal approach to transit, helping make the city more livable and walkable and improving the quality of life for Tempe residents. Like many cities in Arizona and across the country, they face challenges taking good, locally driven ideas, like the Tempe streetcar, and bringing them to life. I'm proud to have worked with the city to secure critical funding for the streetcar, and the federal government needs to continue to be a reliable, capable partner that helps cities and towns across Arizona grow and thrive. I'm so pleased to have an Arizona witness in today's hearing, and I'm committed to ensuring that the infrastructure needs of local Arizona communities are met now and into the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mayor Woods.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. I'll introduce the next two witnesses. Commissioner Josh Parsons is the chairman of the Board of County Commissioners in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He served as the county commission on the county commission since 2015, previously serving as the clerk of courts, a prosecutor in the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office, and an infantry officer in the Army. Brian Riedel is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute focusing on budget, tax, and economic policy. He previously served as chief economist to one of our colleagues, to my colleague, Senator Rob Portman, as the lead research fellow on federal budget and spending policy from 2001 to 2011. Welcome, both Commissioner Parsons and Mr. Riedel. You are now recognized for 5 minutes, Mayor Horrigan, to begin.
Good morning, and good morning, Chairman Brown and members of the Banking and Housing and Urban Affairs Committee. I'm honored to provide testimony to the committee on the critical need for a comprehensive approach and the understanding of housing and transportation infrastructure and how they are a backbone for all of our communities. And I would ask the committee to submit my testimony in full for the record. And I'm privileged to serve as the mayor of Akron, Ohio, and represent roughly 200,000 people. We are the home of Goodyear, Bridgestone, Firestone, Gojo Industries, and I would venture a guess as if I looked around all of your desks, I would see bottles of Purell. They're made right here in Akron and in Ohio. So thank you for the support. The University of Akron and so many other essential industries. Our people are the resilient but burdened workers of the industrial heartland. We are a legacy city, and we are in critical need of infrastructure investment. And as a mayor, I deal with the daily reality of how the federal government impacts local citizens and the economic impact Congress has on Americans. Over the past few decades, Akron has experienced economic downturns with major companies on the verge of leaving, a pandemic that has shut down our local businesses, and critical housing issues exacerbated by the Great Recession over a decade ago that we are still addressing. Communities of color have been the hardest hit by these crises, and racial and wealth income disparities are vicious and persistent in the city of Akron as they are across the country. Housing is a basic human need, and this is something I believe we can all agree on. In fact, by creating HUD, a cabinet-level position over 50 years ago, cemented this truism for all of us. But housing is also a unique and complex network of physical and financial structures, regulated and managed by federal, state, and local institutions. Local municipalities have been faced with major problems such as foreclosures, an aging housing stock, out-of-town landlords, banks not lending, and insufficient federal housing investments. Housing is critical infrastructure. All other infrastructure, whether it be water meters, roads, electrical lines, broadband fiber, sewers, ultimately connect to houses. Many of the most frequently discussed housing topics covered by the national media are simply not issues in the city like Akron. Our challenge is not displacement by the poor, by the wealthy, or middle-class people being priced out of the market and having to make long commutes into the city. Our challenge is property values that are often too low to allow capital stacks for new housing construction or home improvement loans that residents of modest means. We need a federal infrastructure framework that is geared towards cities like Akron, legacy cities like Akron. And we need programs that help leverage private capital for real estate investment and development so we can keep existing residents in their homes, attract new residents to our city, and create markets for retail and other small businesses that can serve and employ our residents. Finally, we cannot ask our citizens to return to work without first ensuring they have a healthy and stable place to return home. With regard to surface transportation and transit options for workers like housing, our challenges are not necessarily those that you read about in the national media. My constituents are not facing 2-hour-long commutes or intolerable levels of traffic congestion. Our challenge instead is maintaining the legacy of infrastructure that was built for a city that once had 30% more population than it does today, with the limited tax base that is supported by working class residents. Our residents have put real skin in the game, demonstrating their willingness to invest in our infrastructure by voting in favor of a recent local tax increase for roadway improvements. But that doesn't come close to addressing all of the transportation investments. It doesn't eliminate the need for a federal transportation program that focuses on maintaining the roads that we already have and providing more assistance for alternatives to driving, such as public transit, bike, and pedestrian improvements. It doesn't help electrify our bus fleet, or replace our crumbling transit maintenance facility, or expand the bus rapid transit in the neighborhood cut off from the regional economy. During this pandemic, the United States Congress have asked people to contribute to their local economy by continuing to work, keep paying their mortgages and taxes, and most did just that. Further, as we emerge from the pandemic, we want those who lost employment to come back to work. That requires stable housing and the means to get to and from that job. Finally, housing is a foundation of a healthy community. I firmly believe that investing in the housing infrastructure is the absolute best way we can help our children thrive in school, decrease the neighborhood blight and violence. Stronger and more stable housing is the key to Akron's future for our country and our future, and I would argue it's where all infrastructure begins and ends. Thank you for the opportunity to offer these thoughts, and I look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Mayor Horgan. Mayor Andrus is recognized for 5 minutes.
Morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the Senate Banking Committee. It's an honor to testify before you this morning about the infrastructure challenges facing cities and towns across our country. As you know, my name is Cindy Andrus, and I'm the mayor of Bozeman, Montana, a city of about 50,000 located in the southwest corner of the state, 90 miles north of Yellowstone National Park. We are one of the fastest growing cities of our size in the United States. To support that growth, we need infrastructure, water and sewer infrastructure, robust public transit options, and faster broadband. But at the end of every sewer line, bus route, and broadband fiber conduit is a home, a long-term hard capital asset. High-quality infrastructure must include affordable housing, period. I am here today to ask your help in solving our housing crisis and to offer some thoughtful solutions to a growing problem, not just in Bozeman, but across the country. In April of 2021, the median single-family home price in Bozeman was $660,000, a 50% increase over 1 year. Townhomes and apartments experienced a 22.4% median price increase during that same time period. Unfortunately, wages are not able to keep up pace with these costs. Business owners cannot find employees. Third, fourth, and fifth generation Montanans are considering uprooting their families, and young couples who have built businesses and want to start a family no longer see a way to be long-term members of our community. I hear stories from business owners every week about top-tier candidates turning down jobs because they cannot find an affordable place to live. These are not just businesses looking for workers making $15 an hour, but potential employees with PhDs and salary offers between $75,000 and $100,000 per year. We have been working with community members and developers to solve our affordable housing crisis for years now, using every possible tool and incentive to get housing built. In 2018, we passed an inclusionary zoning ordinance. This led to the construction of 17 affordable homes and more than $448,000 for our cash in lieu program. We have an additional 50 homes in the pipeline when in April this year, the legislature outlawed the tool, putting a stop to the progress we made tackling this affordable housing crisis. Still, we continue to find ways to incentivize affordable housing construction through reduced impact fees, reduced minimum lot sizes, and reduced parking requirements. We have also hired code experts to identify where our code unintentionally drives up the price of a home through onerous overregulation. But it is not enough. The rising cost of land, labor, and lumber force prices out of reach for many in our community. The federal government needs to recognize that housing is a basic building block of our community. Why build the infrastructure if no one can afford to live in the community? We need housing that everyone can afford, not just the wealthy. We need your help. Here are a few ideas. Provide more flexibility and access to tools like CDBG and HOME to work for every community to construct more housing. A one-size-fits-all solution does not work. Provide resources to assist communities in simplifying their development review process through hiring more staff and auditing the entirety of their code. Offer a program that offsets the cost of infrastructure construction and improvement in exchange for denser development. In addition to housing, our public transit system in Bozeman needs significant federal investment. It is an invaluable service providing over 300,000 rides per year. Federal money could help expand routes and upgrade to a greener fleet to align with our climate goals to reduce carbon emissions. I believe we are doing everything we can with the tools we have to get affordable housing built in Bozeman. I do not expect the federal government to build new housing from the ground up, but I do have an expectation that you will do something by providing tools to local governments to fill the gaps that the private sector is not currently meeting. On behalf of the 50,000 residents in Bozeman, I'm asking you to include housing in the American Jobs Plan and to fund it as the long-term capital asset it is. Thank you, Chair Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the Banking Committee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mayor Andrews. Mayor Woods is recognized for 5 minutes. Mayor Woods, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to be here today to speak with you about the housing and transportation infrastructure needs of America's cities. I'm the mayor of Tempe, Arizona, and the 2020 census will likely say that about 200,000 residents live within our borders. However, due to the many residents and businesses that call Tempe home, including the main campus of Arizona State University, we have a daytime population that is 70% greater than our census population. We are a landlocked community, so we only have the option to build as we continue to grow in size. With our focus on sustainable development, density and public transportation are central to our city's long-term planning. The median income of Tempe residents is about $58,000, a bit lower than the national average of $62,800. But the average cost of a home is more than $270,000, nearly 25% higher than the national average. In Tempe, this disparity between income and housing costs results in 42% of renters and 24% of homeowners being considered cost burden, which HUD defines as a household paying more than 30% of their annual gross income on housing expenses. In addition to a dire need for more affordable housing for middle-income workers, we have also struggled with the housing needs of individuals experiencing homelessness. From 2015 to 2020, Tempe experienced an increase of over 900% in our unsheltered population. Federal programs such as the Community Development Block Grants, Home Investment Partnership Programs, and Emergency Solutions Grant funding have become essential components in delivering housing options for our most vulnerable populations. In 2016, Valor on 8th, a 50-unit affordable housing complex that serves veterans and their families, opened to our community. This project used CDBG to acquire the land, and home funds assisted with the construction of the facility. Low-income housing tax credits were also utilized to finance the development, with project-based vouchers in the facility also allow for long-term affordability to be financially viable for its residents. And just last week, I was at the construction site of the nation's first 3D printed home. The city of Tempe transferred the property, originally purchased through CDBG funds, to Habitat for Humanity for the construction of 16 total homes. Our city is heavily invested in affordable housing initiatives, and through our Hometown for All initiative, we negotiate voluntary contributions from developers to our affordable housing fund, and we dedicate an amount equal to half of all permitting fees to these efforts. Unfortunately, even with our city's own investments, private partnerships, and creative use of federal programs, we do not come close to meeting the needs of our cost-burdened residents, nor addressing our extraordinary increase in unsheltered individuals. Tempe has benefited from a 55% increase in allocations of CDBG, home, and ESG over the last 5 years. And this upward trajectory of federal support is critical to us to continue our collaboration with our private and nonprofit partners. We simply cannot begin to meet the housing needs of our residents without increased federal support. Public transportation is the other key to Tempe's sustainable growth strategy. Many of Tempe's future affordable housing projects will be strategically located along the existing metro area light rail system. We've also been very fortunate to have broad support from our business community for a proposed expansion of the system known as the Tempe Streetcar Program. Businesses along that corridor have actually voluntarily increased their self-assessments to meet the project's funding needs. We also work very closely with our private sector partners to plan Tempe's future through thoughtful development that includes affordable housing and public transportation to ensure financial stability and access to economic opportunity for Tempe residents. We invest a significant amount of Tempe tax dollars into these efforts and are committed to expanding these community resources. We are hopeful for an increased investment from the federal government so they can become an even bigger partner in the process of planning for Tempe's future. I'd also be remiss if I didn't note that our city is managing through challenging financial times. The city's hotel transaction privilege tax revenues are down 50% January 2021 as compared to January 2020, reflecting the steep decline in travel and tourism to our region. Similarly, tax revenue derived from restaurants and bars and amusements is down over 20% and 60% respectively over the same period. The loss of special events, ASU attendance, workers coming into the high rises, conferences, and spring training has meant that the city has fewer resources to provide services while our residents and businesses are experiencing more needs. Increased investments in infrastructure would provide the city with an important tool to address the negative economic effects of COVID-19 and continue to develop our community with a sustainable and smart approach. We need continued and increased federal dollars to supplement our local investments in affordable housing, public transit, infrastructure, and programs to provide relief to the homeless, those at risk of eviction, and other at-risk groups as our economy recovers and local revenues get back on track. I'm grateful for the time you've allowed me to speak today about Tempe's perspective, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mayor Woods. Commissioner Parsons, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and the other members of the committee. My name is Josh Parsons, and I'm Chairman of the Board of County Commissioners in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I'm a former prosecutor and former Army infantry officer. The Board of County Commissioners is the seat of legislative and executive powers in the county and has broad authority over the county's budget, finances, taxes, debts, and contracts. At around 550,000 citizens, Lancaster County is the sixth most populous of Pennsylvania's 67 counties. Although we're best known for our Amish and Mennonite communities, like Pennsylvania itself, we're a diverse community with urban, suburban, and rural residents. Lancaster County is made up of 60 municipalities, 1 city, 18 boroughs, and 41 townships. We pride ourselves on fiscal responsibility and restraint. Lancaster County government has approximately the highest general fund balance, which is like a personal savings account for an individual, that it has ever had. This was achieved through conservative budget management, not through raising taxes. Lancaster County's current Board of Commissioners has never raised taxes, and in fact, our county taxes have not been raised in nearly a decade, which is difficult to do as a county in Pennsylvania. Lancaster County is the third lowest tax rate of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania and the lowest of any large county. Our bond rating has been rising, and we've been good stewards of our infrastructure. We're steadily working through a plan to repair or replace all of our structurally deficient county bridges. Like everywhere else, the last year and a half has been a challenge for Lancaster County. We went into COVID with the best economy we'd seen in a generation. Our businesses were thriving and our wages were rising for all groups and demographics. The impact of the pandemic and our governor's ensuing draconian lockdowns and refusal to address the economic damage of the pandemic did great harm to our economy. However, I'm very proud of our county's response to COVID. Our county favored a middle course where we addressed COVID and the economic crisis. We pulled together as a community and executed in what was in many ways a model medical and economic recovery plan in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The Federal CARES Act resources were instrumental in this recovery. Lancaster County received approximately $95 million. This was a huge amount of money for us. These funds were dispersed to us very rapidly after the passage of the bill and arrived during the crisis. We in turn put the money quickly to use for both medical and economic recovery plans across our county. The CARES Act had sufficient flexibility in the Treasury guidance that counties were able to use it in varied and necessary ways. As fiscal conservatives, we were, of course, concerned about the costs of the CARES Act and the debt being accrued at the national level to pay for it, but we recognized it was a necessary response to the crisis because the government had effectively shut down the economy and prevented people from earning a living. We felt a heavy responsibility to use this money wisely to help our community. Unlike the CARES Act, I do not think the so-called American Rescue Plan was necessary. Under this act, Lancaster County is slated to receive another $106 million. Again, this is a huge amount of money for us. Moreover, every other county in Pennsylvania and many other municipalities are receiving allocations. This money is arriving after the COVID crisis is over, and now come proposals for even more money to be sent out through an infrastructure plan. At this point, rather than sending out more money, the better solution would be to get government fully out of the way and let the economy come roaring back. As I talk to people around my county, what I hear about is concern about costs going up. Groceries, gas, lumber, everything costs more. Inflation is a natural and predictable result of huge amounts of money being pumped into the economy. Numbers from May show inflation is up 5%. All this new money is chasing the same amount of goods and services, including here in Lancaster County. Inflation hurts working class people in Lancaster County the worst because rising prices of things like groceries and gas outpace wages. You can see and feel this happening already around us. It also eats away at the value of any money put away in a bank account for a rainy day. So I would fervently ask that before you consider borrowing more money from our grandchildren to hand out across the country, just stop and take a pause. There's a huge amount of money already circulating. For example, if you want to provide for infrastructure, Congress could allow more flexibility for counties and other municipalities in the use of the existing American Rescue Plan funds. What need there still is could then be addressed in a much more targeted way. Please do not further bankrupt our country and take from our yet unborn grandchildren without waiting to use the existing massive amounts of money that have already been distributed to states and local governments like ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Parsons. Mr. Riedel is recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearings. My name is Brian Riedel. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I'll offer 4 principles for a responsible infrastructure proposal. First, Congress should avoid piling on new taxes and debt. The federal budget outlook is already totally unsustainable, and the American Jobs Plan would be the most expensive non-emergency law in half a century. And it's coming at a time when the national debt is already projected to double from $17 trillion to $35 trillion between 2019 and 2030. And it gets worse. Washington is projected by CBO to run $100 trillion in budget deficits over the next 30 years. And that's assuming low interest rates. If interest rates exceed the CBO baseline by 1 percentage point, it would add $30 trillion in additional interest costs over 3 decades. Just 1% rise in interest rates. Even if this infrastructure spending is mostly paid for in new taxes, it is still not fiscally responsible because we already need nearly every progressive tax proposal just to pay for the current programs we have. Let's pay for our current commitments before piling on new ones. Second, states should use the federal windfalls they have received. State and local governments are in the process of receiving $350 billion for budget deficits that mostly no longer exist. As Mr. Toomey mentioned, California is reporting a $75 billion budget surplus. States are also holding approximately $180 billion in unspent K-12 education grants from earlier relief bills. That's $530 billion in short-term funding for state and local governments that are mostly in surplus. The best use of a large one-time windfall is to make a large one-time investment in infrastructure, which is mostly a state and local function anyway. Washington can even use matching funds if necessary to encourage states to reapply this money. Third, any additional federal funding should be funded within the current $61 trillion spending baseline over the decade. Any federal matching funds or truly national projects can be funded this way. For example, trimming discretionary spending by just 1.5% this year would save $500 billion over the decade that could be spent on infrastructure. Cutting spending on the rich could save $1 trillion over the decade. If infrastructure is truly a national priority, the responsible offsets are already there within the budget. Finally, while infrastructure can certainly use some upgrades, lack of funding is not the main problem. Rather, America's infrastructure is among the most expensive, bureaucratic, and slowly built in the world. Consider that CBO reports that federal investments deliver average returns of just 5% versus 10% for private sector investments. The per mile cost of the interstate highway construction quadrupled from 1960 through 1990 and has quadrupled again since. The Davis-Bacon Act raises wage costs by as much as 22%. Mandatory project labor agreements add cost too. Our subway systems cost as much as quadruple the world average to build. Many delays are driven by the necessary but slow environmental impact statements and historical artifact reviews. Consider that environmental reviews commonly exceed 1,000 pages and average 7 years to complete, some taking more than 17 years. And no ground can be broken until the project has survived the legal gauntlet, including appeals by any litigant. By comparison, these statements take 1 to 2 years in Canada and 3.5 years in the EU. Let me wrap up by predicting that we may hear much today about how investments will grow the economy and bring in enough revenue to nearly pay for themselves. Yet the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Wharton budget model reports that investments in the American Jobs Plan will, over the long run, create no net jobs, reduce wages by 0.3%, reduce the capital stock by 1.5%, and reduce the GDP by 0.3%. That's just the spending side. The taxes would make the drag even larger, and Penn Wharton cannot be dismissed as a right-wing group. Therefore, I recommend that Congress encourage state and local governments to use their $500 billion in recent aid, offset any federal supplemental funding, and reform our infrastructure policies to make them more effective and efficient. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Riedel. We'll begin the questions. Let's start with Mayor Horrigan. Some have suggested, given the federal funding Akron has received from the American Rescue Plan Act, that you're flush with cash. That's the rhetoric. But Mayor, what's the reality? Is there anything extra or, quote, left over that can be used for the housing and public transit investments that you've called for in your community?
You know, I've heard those concerns about being flush with cash. We're also dealing with a state legislature that wants to even the score kind of and cut our funding. We don't run, we have to run a balanced budget every year, so we don't get a chance to borrow to be able to make sure that we can do that. The other part of that is that it kind of reminds me of an analogy too. When a leadoff hitter comes up at the beginning of a baseball game and they hit a home run, the crowd cheers and his teammates are congratulating him, but the manager's not so sure yet because he knows that if there's 8 2/3 innings just left yet before they have to get to the rest of the game, it's a good start. That transportation infrastructure, the rescue plan dollars have been a good start to be able to address a lot of those needs. And I understand the amounts. are staggering to that way, but there's a significant amount of investment that we have made. And quite frankly, we're looking for partners on these things too. And I agree that, some of those things that take a long time for environmental review, also look at, some of the mandates from the EPA. I mean, we are still working through our consent decree, which was $1 billion mandate from the EPA that received no funding. At the end of the day, we have to go out and fix these things. We can't wait for necessarily for someone to come along, but it really sure would be nice to have a partner in a lot of these efforts too.
Mayor Horgan, thank you. Your city, many parts of your city, North Akron and Goodyear Heights and Firestone Park and Kenmore look a lot like parts of the neighborhood that I live in Cleveland. The homes may look affordable, but too often banks won't make the small mortgage loans that families need to buy or fix them up. What would it mean for a young family and for the growth of the community in Akron if there were funds available to do repairs on these homes, existing homes that could sell for 50 or 60 or 80 or 90,000 a year?
When 6 years ago, I kind of started this with a question to the community. And to me, I think it's a customer service question. And I asked them, tell me what you want. And they said, we want to be able to stay in our neighborhoods. We want to be able to have a decent job. How are we able to fix up homes? And even if we took the rescue plan dollars now, we could probably fix up, depending on whether it's a $20,000 not an addition, but an improvement to a home. We're also an age-friendly city. So if it's a young family who wants to move in, and we want to be able to give them, a house that's livable. We have an aging housing stock that most of it was built before 1970. In fact, we did more construction, during the 20s and 30s than we did in the last 20 years. Fortunately, we've seen a significant amount of construction in new housing. We have an oversupply of bad housing. So if we can repair those houses and help those young families, they're able to stay in Akron. And we're trying to grow our population. And there's each different markets to say, what do different neighborhoods want? Some want to stay and improve their homes. Maybe somebody wants to downsize. Those are all the different markets that we're trying to be in. And we're actually seeing, a fairly robust real estate market where time on market has been cut in half. And the average price of a home has almost doubled in the last 6 years because we haven't been able to keep up with that supply.
Well, we know in a city like yours or a city like Lancaster or York, Pennsylvania, that the housing that is that old often has challenges with lead-based paint and all of that too. Mayor Wood, what would it mean for a city like Tempe if you could count on federal funding being available, count on it available for new transit projects as soon as you could use it instead of waiting for years? Would that affect how quickly you could get workers on the job?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's a huge connection, Senator, between, like how housing and transit equate to job growth. I mean, just as a connection, we have a 28-mile-long light rail line that spans from Mesa to Tempe to Phoenix that opened in 2008. And since then, over 35,000 jobs have been created within a half mile of those rail services. And if you add on to that, there's been over $11 billion in public and private investment in that corridor and 5.5 million square feet of new education facilities. So the connections between sort of transit investment and quality of life and job growth are very clear from our perspective. So the reality is increased federal funding and more support for infrastructure would be huge to the city of Tempe and huge for our entire region.
Thank you. Mayor Andrus, you and Mayor Woods both lead cities that are fast growing, attracting new residents, especially from the West Coast. That's creating a housing challenge, as you mentioned. Would additional federal investments in affordable housing help you meet these challenges? You're on mute, Mayor. Okay, go ahead. Start again, please.
Sorry. Yes, absolutely. Additional dollars would help us, whether that's additional dollars through new programming or additional dollars to look at how we can access programs that already exist and allow more flexibility in some of those programs that already exist would be very helpful to my community.
Thank you, Mayor. Senator Toomey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Parsons, first of all, thanks very much for joining us. I think you mentioned that Lancaster County will receive about $106 million as a result of the bill passed in March by our Democratic colleagues. And that 106 is on top of roughly $95 million Lancaster County got from the CARES Act. So that's $201 million in just a little over a year. Approximately, if you happen to know off the top of your head, about what percentage of the total Lancaster County budget is that?
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Our total budget with state money is about $334 million. Our general fund budget, which is mostly county money, is about $215 million. So you're talking about basically the whole value of our general fund, budget. Our yearly total budget, it's, about 2/3 of it.
About 2/3. Now, Lancaster County, as I understand it, was a county in which revenue was a little bit below last year. Do you know about how much lost revenue you had that could be reasonably attributed to COVID and the lockdown?
We're estimating right now it's somewhere around $9 million for 2020.
Around 9 million. So the federal government, between the CARES Act and this most recent bill, sent 25 times the lost revenue approximately. So let me ask you about another question. If it were the case that states and municipalities simply couldn't borrow funds when needed, then I understand how people would suggest, well, that's something the federal government can do, so we ought to do this. But my understanding is across the credit rating spectrum, large and small municipalities alike, borrowing costs for states and municipalities are actually significantly below their pre-COVID levels, and municipal debt issuance has been very strong. So far in 2021, state and local governments have issued nearly $190 billion in bonds. The same period in 2019, an ordinary year pre-COVID, was only $152 billion. So the combination of low interest rates and high volume certainly doesn't suggest that municipalities can't borrow. Now, I understand Lancaster County's awash with cash from the federal government, so you don't need to issue debt. But if you did, do you think the county would have a difficult time issuing bonds or otherwise borrowing funds that were needed?
I talked to a lot of my colleagues around the state, and I'm not aware of any difficulty in borrowing for capital projects. In Lancaster County, we're trying to pay down our debt. We've paid down around $100 million of debt, and we'd like to continue that. But we do, from time to time, still need to borrow new money or sometimes refinance debt. We did that, I think, twice last year, once in March, right around the beginning of the pandemic, and then once in August. And we didn't have any difficulty borrowing, and I'm not aware of any significant difficulty.
Thank you. Mr. Riedel, you made a point that U.S. infrastructure tends to be more costly than our international peers, which is kind of maddening for taxpayers to think that they have to pay more than the going rate, so to speak. An example that is pretty amazing, New York's East Side Access Project, which will connect the Long Island Railroad with New York's Grand Central Station, is estimated to cost $3.5 billion per mile, which is more than 7 times the international average for this type of project. 7 times. Can you help us understand why American infrastructure is so expensive and inefficient?
Thank you, Senator. There's multiple reasons. If you're looking at the New York system, they have even that's actually not atypical. 4 times the global average is the subway cost in New York City. A lot of it, the reason for American infrastructure is expensive, as I mentioned, the environmental reviews can take 7, sometimes 17 years to finish. And then you have to build defensively, because basically anybody can challenge the environmental reviews and the historical artifacts reviews. There's so many lawsuits that can delay you for years. So you end up with defensive construction that's more meant to avoid lawsuits than to necessarily build efficiency. You also have things like the Davis-Bacon Act, which I know a lot of senators will cost. You also simply have contracting problems where often governments contract with the lowest bid, even with contractors who have a reputation for going way over the cost. There's a lot of places to reform infrastructure.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Van Hollen, I'm not sure is here. He is not. Chair Smith from Minnesota is recognized.
Chair Brown, does my identification still say Chair Smith? Or
No, it doesn't, but I thought I'd say it anyway because of your good, the excellent subcommittee you chaired last week. So I won't make it a habit, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Brown, and also Ranking Member Toomey. And I want to thank very much all of our guests today. It's great to hear from you. I think that we have such a huge opportunity in this moment to make significant strides forward on infrastructure. And I approach this conversation from as being a former chief of staff for the mayor of Minneapolis and understanding what mayors go through as they're trying to address real needs in their community. And I'd like to focus in on two of those if I can today. The first is affordable housing. And if we have a moment, I'd like to also talk a little bit about clean energy infrastructure. These are two things that I think are essential to include in the American Jobs Plan infrastructure package that the Senate is working on. So I suspect that as mayors, you all are experiencing firsthand the crisis of housing in our country, a complete mismatch between supply and demand for housing, especially affordable housing, and especially for renters. I'm interested in hearing what it's like in your cities. There is a shortage of housing stock, and this, I think, is something that we can really address, both rental housing as well as home ownership. Now, what I hear in Minnesota is that the cost of new construction is a significant barrier to building, especially in rural areas, but also in small towns and big cities. And that we're seeing sort of all sorts of challenges with supply chain as we build out of COVID, literally, and particularly lumber, for example. By some estimates, the recent lumber shortage has raised the price of building a new home by almost $40,000. And then also there are issues, just so many issues. So let me ask the mayors on that are with us today. What barriers do you see to building new housing in your community, and how can Congress help you as local leaders address these challenges? And maybe I'll start with you, Mayor Woods.
Well, thank you, Chair Smith. Really appreciate it. If Senator Brown calls you Chair Smith, I'm going to call you Chair Smith as well. So I just wanted to say, so on our end, we actually in the city of Tempe recognize from a study that was conducted even before I became mayor that we need 11,000 additional units of housing by the year 2040 just to keep pace with current demand. Some of the challenges, quite honestly, are not just simply the cost of lumber and steel and everything else. It's the fact that our state legislature has implemented policies such as we are the only state in the entire country without tax increment financing as a tool. Inclusionary zoning, rent control, those are all practices that have been banned by our state legislature. But the reality is, from being a mayor on the ground, and you know this from being a former chief of staff to a mayor, that we still have an obligation to provide housing and solutions to our cities. I can't just as a mayor blame the state legislature and wash my hands of it. We have to figure out other ways to get things done. So we've currently invested $1.2 million of city-owned funds from our Hometown for All program, which we developed in a proprietary fashion here to clean up 5 different lots of land along our light rail corridor for development. The purpose of that is to make sure that when we're giving land to developers, they're actually getting clean dirt without the remediation costs, which allows for them to truly deliver affordable and workforce housing solutions. And we think with all of what we're currently doing just as a city, we will get in the next couple of years 325 units of new affordable rental housing and 50 more affordable home ownership units as well. But that, as we said, from the 11,000 units I first talked about, that only scratches the surface. So we need additional support from the federal government to make sure that everyone can continue to live and work within our city, regardless of income and regardless of occupation.
Thank you. Thank you. Mayor Andrus, I'm sure you experience what mayors in my state experience, which is that a lack of access to housing becomes a limiting factor on economic growth because companies can't find people to work if there aren't places for them to live. And Bozeman is a fast rate growing community. How can the federal government help communities like Bozeman on housing?
Well, I thank you for the question. I agree that we are one of the fastest growing cities in the entire country, and we are doing everything we can, reducing impact fees and reducing minimum lot sizes and parking requirements. But I think where the government can help is to look at the existing programs and allow more flexibility and access in those particular areas. Particularly when you think about the size of Bozeman, almost 50,000, we fall within the cracks there. We're not big enough to be a city. We're too big to be considered rural. So I think looking at those existing programs and really thinking about flexibility there. And I would also just add that preemption is becoming a huge issue in Bozeman and in Montana as well, with the legislature taking away tools, as I mentioned in my testimony, like inclusionary zoning. We also have a real short houses that do come on the market, they're on for less than a month. So our turnover is quite rapid.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair Brown. I'll hold my clean energy questions for later if we have time.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Scott from South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. It's really important, certainly, and thank you to the ranking member Toomey for participating in this process as well. So important for us to uncover some of the ways that we could accelerate some of the projects that are so important to our local communities. As many of you may recognize, I spent 13 years on the county level, 4 times as the chairman of Charleston County government, and I will say that the length of time that it takes to go through the environmental process to see road projects begin is incredibly important. I remember one Southeastern rail project that was submitted in 1992 and was not approved until 2017. We have projects in our state, projects that are really important to the citizens of the Low Country and especially coastal South Carolina. Projects like I-73 that is a really important project for my state, and frankly would create about 29,000 jobs in addition to providing a hurricane evacuation route for those folks living in Horry County. This is a product of a 30-year planning process with environmental permit requests submitted back in 2011 and finally completed just a few years ago. The previous administration sought to address the long-standing issue of environmental requirements, delaying progress by codifying interagency requirements that would hopefully bring it down to about a 2-year process as opposed to 5 years or 7 years, or as in the rail project that I just named, 25 years. I was incredibly disappointed to see that the executive order was revoked by the Biden administration, signaling a return to a lengthy, overly detailed permitting and environmental review process for new infrastructure projects. Let me ask Mr. Parson and Mr. Riedel, how can Congress work to responsibly address the strenuous environmental regulation times so that states and municipal governments can reap the benefits of these much needed projects in a timely fashion?
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. And I agree with your comments. I was at the White House when President Trump had a discussion with many of our colleagues across the country at the county level about rolling back many of those burdensome environmental regulations, which really, as you mentioned, add years and years to the process. The other piece, I think, for our county is there is a huge amount of money that's already been allocated. So if we can repurpose some of that money and allow it to be used for actual infrastructure, like the most recent American Rescue Plan funds, a lot of that we're not even going to be able to use it on infrastructure unless some Treasury changes some of the guidance on that. So I think that's the 2 pieces I would have to add.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that too. One key difference between the U.S. versus Canada and the EU is when they have disputes with the environmental review process with local stakeholders, they're solved at the agency level very quickly. In the United States, they're solved through lawsuits that can take years. So a very simple fix, which is to adjudicate at the agency level instead of through lawsuits, could significantly cut down the amount of time while still making sure that stakeholders have a voice.
Thank you, Mr. Riedel. I will say that before I left as chairman of county council in Charleston County, I approved projects for new road projects to take the truck traffic through minority neighborhoods out of those neighborhoods through an access road. That road was literally just finished. I think I approved that in 2007, I think it was, this year. 14 years later, and much of the delay, literally the environmental studies that need to be done. No one's suggesting they don't need to be done, but when there are challenges or issues, we need to find a way to accelerate that process so that we won't see road projects double in price before we actually get it done. The voters say yes to something on the local level, but that they don't see for 14 years. That's just ridiculous. And I really appreciate both of your comments. And Mr. Chairman, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thanks, Senator Scott. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all the witnesses. Thank you for being here. Mayor Woods, I have a question for you about the home program, which in most states, local jurisdictions, cities, is the primary federal tool available to local governments to produce more affordable rental and owner-occupied housing. It's a flexible program. So my question to you is that President Biden has proposed an additional $35 billion for this program as part of his American Jobs Plan, his Build Back Better initiative. Could you talk about how you might use some of these funds to build and produce more affordable housing?
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Appreciate the question. We actually use home funds in the city of Tempe to purchase units outright. Our housing department is very active. We are a completely landlocked 42 square mile community. And so all of the development, frankly, is infill. It's redeveloping things that were already developed. So we actually go out there and actively purchase land ourselves and purchase units with those home funds. And what we really feel that this allows us to do is to create permanent affordability, not a situation where we have to do a deal kind of in a one-off with the developer and they have the rates as sort of workforce for a couple of years. Then at some point, the apartment complex gets flipped and then the rates simply become market rate or luxury rates. We really do use those funds to ensure that the city can really be in the driver's seat with our hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, purchasing units outright, expanding the affordable and workforce housing in our community, and most importantly, making those units permanently affordable.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Horrigan, in addition to programs like the home program that can help expand production of affordable housing, I think most folks who have looked at this agree that we also need to expand the HUD affordable housing voucher programs, choice vouchers. In fact, Senator Todd Young from Indiana and I have introduced bipartisan legislation to expand the use of vouchers for families with young kids. We proposed a $500,000 additional vouchers over 5 years. Could you comment on that? Is it your experience that there's a shortage of affordable housing vouchers in your city?
Well, thank you, Senator Van Hollen. We, in fact, we work very closely with our public housing authority. In fact, there's a significant shortage. There's probably a 19,000 person waiting list at this particular point. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we passed legislation locally that prevents landlords from refusing a voucher during the pandemic. So we need to be able to keep people in their homes. One of the first things I did, and this was back 5 years ago, we took a really good look at our housing market. And quite frankly, we had issued about 15 building permits in 2014. Last year, there's about 1,000 building permits issued that are in construction or are finished. And one of the things that we tried to do, and I think it highlights what Mayor Woods just says, with the strong demand, we didn't have any demand. The housing market was coded and it was flatlined. So we needed to incentivize the market. So we abated property taxes for 15 years. That part has worked. So we're seeing a lot of new housing being constructed, but what are we doing with the aging housing stock? And I don't care if it's my mom who needs to stay in her home and she needs a ramp, and I don't care if it's a young family that maybe needs a new furnace. That's the kind of flexibility, I think, partnership that we can all kind of agree on to say, let's keep a person in their home. Let's let them use a voucher to be able to stay there, because it's kind of that critical piece. If you want to be able to get to your job, you got to have a way to get there, and you got to have somewhere to come back to. And I think that has been our focus. How do we use all of those different capital stacks and partnerships to keep people in their home, and I think growing our city once again.
I appreciate that, Mayor Horrigan. And, my view is that one of the shortcomings of the proposed American Jobs Plan is that it doesn't create a major additional source of funds for the affordable housing voucher programs. The president's budget does a very good job, but we'll be working with the chairman and ranking members and others on this other piece. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Daines from Montana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you, as well as Ranking Member Toomey, and thanks for holding this hearing today. And I'm especially proud to see my very own mayor of my hometown, Mayor Andrus, here. I went to kindergarten through college in Bozeman, and it's good to have our mayor in front of the hearing. I don't have to tell anyone here on the call and this virtual hearing that Montana has been discovered. Just this weekend, in fact, the New York Post wrote an article about the out of control housing market in Montana and the desire for more and more people to move into our great state. We understand why that's the case, but it creates additional burden for our infrastructure. And that's nothing new for Bozeman. We've seen this rapid growth now over the last decade. And frankly, during my lifetime watching what's happening in Bozeman, it's just accelerated into a level now that we've never seen before. As you're probably all aware, a recommendation to increase the threshold of a metropolitan statistical area called MSAs from 50,000 to 100,000 residents was made to the Office of Management and Budget earlier this spring. I penned my own letter to OMB. I know we're working together here with Senator Tester, expressing my opposition to this proposal and joining a number of my colleagues in this effort as well. Bozeman is one of the fastest and has been the fastest growing micropolitan in the country. And we just recently crossed that 50,000 threshold. So now we are called a metropolitan. Mayor Andrus, could you talk for a moment about the impact this change would have on the affected Montana communities and what it would mean in the future?
Thank you, Senator. It's nice to see you, and I appreciate the question. Yeah, I think that Bozeman has been preparing to become a city of 50,000 for some time now, and changing the goalposts, so to speak, in the middle of the game would be a real game changer. Monies that we get from the federal government, particularly around transit, have a significant impact in my community, and without that availability, all those options we're not able to access any of those options for housing or for transportation. So I believe that if that number were to change, it would have a severe impact on our opportunities to access funding as we grow into a larger community.
Thanks, Mayor. And I agree with you. I think it's changing the rules kind of in the middle of the game that is the most concerning as you all work your long-term plans for growth in the future. And I appreciate that answer. As many warn, as we know now, the unnecessary stimulus package in March has led to inflation across the board. Regardless, some of my colleagues are pushing for more deficit spending under the impression that the infrastructure somehow will pay for itself. Mr. Riedel, do you think more deficit spending on infrastructure, like what's been requested by the president's plan, is essentially costless?
Thank you for the question. The data shows that it's certainly not costless. For federal spending or tax cuts to pay for themselves, they actually need to have a 500% return on investment, because if you then tax that 500%, you get back the 100%. Instead of a 500%, the CBO reports that federal investments have a 5% return on investment, not 500%. That means that in terms of paying for themselves, you would need 100 years to pay for 1/5 of the programs in net present value. That doesn't mean that these programs are unworthy or that we shouldn't do them, but they're not going to pay for themselves. I will add that that's just for typical investments. In terms of the American Jobs Plan, the University of Pennsylvania Penn Wharton budget model concluded that the American Jobs Plan spending provisions will create no net jobs, will reduce wages by 0.3% over the long term, reduce the capital stock by 1.5%, and reduce the long-term GDP by 0.3% over the long term. And again, Penn Wharton is not a conservative group. So not only is investments, while sometimes worthy, don't pay for themselves, the specific investments in the American Jobs Plan have actually been projected by Penn to reduce economic growth.
Thank you, Mr. Riedel. Chairman Brown, I'm going to return some time back to you. I know it's highly unusual in a Senate hearing, but thank you for the time. And Mayor Andrus, really good to have you here. Your background there makes me homesick.
Thank you, Senator Daines. The senior senator from Montana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chairman Brown, and I appreciate Senator Daines giving me an extra 30 seconds because Montana's Montana, right? Now, Cindy, it's good to have you here. I very much appreciate your commitment to the cause on housing. From a Bozeman perspective, could you just tell me, number one, and if you've already done this, I apologize, but can you tell me what kind of shortage you have in Bozeman? Is there a number of units that you're short on? If you could tell me that, and then And then tell me what we could do at the federal level to address the affordability challenge. Now, look, I've read some of the testimony. I've heard what some folks have said here, and I may get to a point where we ask that question: is affordable housing even available? It's not in Montana, and I don't think Montana is an outlier. I think it's this way all over the country. But could you tell me what you're short in Bozeman, and then what federal program do you look at and say, you know what, that is really doing some good things for housing?
Thank you, Senator Tester. We, over the last year, have done a study to look at our housing inventory, and we need approximately 6,000 homes to be constructed by 2030. And at the pace we're going, that's a lot of housing to provide. What I believe can help, and I think what I have seen some great impacts are some of those programs that we have right now. But what needs to happen is that there needs to be more flexibility and accessibility in those programs like CDBG and HOME. As you know, Montana's 50,000, and we fall or have fallen between the cracks. So as I mentioned, we're not a large city, we're not considered rural, and so access to those dollars are difficult for us. So as I mentioned before, we have issues around not only housing, but when you don't have housing, you have the economics. People are having a hard time finding employees to work. We have young people that are not able to stay in Bozeman. We have seniors on fixed incomes who are having difficulty here as well. And as you may have seen in our paper in the Bozeman Chronicle last February, I'm sure all of you may have seen this, but there was a young gentleman standing out on a street corner with a sign that said, local business owner, wife pregnant, paid rent for 10 years, please sell me a home. And so that's the kind of problem that we have here. He was lucky enough to find a place, but it's a problem.
So can you tell me, and I don't know if you've had anybody do any projections, or just tell me from a regular old mayor's perspective, is this having a serious negative impact on economic development for Bozeman?
Well, absolutely, because when you have companies that have jobs available between $75,000 and $100,000, for example, and you have top tier candidates that come in and are qualified for those jobs, but they can't find a house. They can't find any affordable housing, even with a job that pays that much. So that's one problem. You also have those folks that are making $15 an hour who are even having a tougher time finding housing. So it's definitely having an impact. Not only that, we have more tourists than we can count. We are not able to have a local option sales tax, even as you know, we have been trying for years and years and years. So that continues to be a problem, as they have a huge impact on our infrastructure here.
Yeah.
So
just so people know, you said you need 6,000 homes by 2030 in the Bozeman region. How many homes do you have currently now? What was that? Is that a 10% of what you have, or 5%, or what?
in terms of the
Your
total amount,
your total houses now, do you know how many that you have now?
I'm sorry, Senator Tester, I don't have that number right off
That's
the top
okay.
of my head.
That's okay. And I want to thank Senator Daines and others who have gotten on the bill that I have to stop the threshold doubling that was done by the Office of Management. That was done, by the way, on the very last day of the Trump administration. I don't know what you did to the Trump administration, Cindy, to make them be so angry with you, but they really put the boots to you on this one. And I am told I was told 3 weeks ago that OMB was going to have a decision on this in a month. Well, guess what? They got 1 week, and hopefully they're listening. And we're looking for them to take it back to the 50,000 population threshold. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll forego the 30 seconds that Senator Daines give me. We can give those to Warnock. Talk to you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Senator Ossoff is recognized for 5 minutes from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel. Mayor Horgan, like you've done in Akron, many cities across Georgia are looking to make major investments in infrastructure, including Columbus, Georgia, the Chattahoochee River Valley region, Muskogee County, And these investments in transit and transportation networks can better connect communities and businesses, make it easier for folks to get to work, attract more jobs and investment. So as we build infrastructure legislation here in the Senate, Mayor Horgan, do you agree that regions of Georgia like the Chattahoochee River Valley, Columbus, Georgia can benefit, as have the community you represent, with major investments in transit and transportation infrastructure?
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely. I mean, we actually, Akron sits between Cleveland and Canton, and I appreciate Senator Dane and Mayor Andrus's efforts to not be on that MSA. They tried to lump us in with Cleveland's MSA. They're a distinct region, and quite frankly, the market will figure out, if people need to get back and forth someplace. We happen to be blessed with 2 federal highways that connect both of those cities, but getting people back there and getting them, on public transportation back and forth to where the jobs are so they can get back home is absolutely critical, for them to be able to get to that job and make sure that they can get back home too. So those investments, they do pay off because people they're able to get around better and they have a stable option to be able to get to work and get back home.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I appreciate that. And Mayor Andrus, like in Bozeman, a lot of the economic development and job growth we're seeing in Georgia is taking place in smaller communities outside of the state capital. Evans, Georgia is the perfect illustration of such a town. Evans is located just outside Augusta, where we have Fort Gordon, which hosts the U.S. Army Cyber Center for Excellence. And from 2015 to 2020, Evans saw a 17% increase in its employed population. Growing cities and towns need to invest in infrastructure to build more roads, connect people with accessible transit, attract more jobs. How could a city like Evans, Georgia, benefit from historic investments in infrastructure based upon your experience leading Bozeman, please?
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the question. Are you asking specifically about housing or transit? Maybe you could clarify that for me.
Your experience with investments in the infrastructure that's right for your community.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think that we have a capital improvement plan that we look at for 5 years out, and we look at where we need to make those investments and what kinds of things are really going to help us open development and open up areas for new building in Montana. And I believe that some of those investments that some of the programs that I mentioned that the federal government offers through the CDBG and the home program, if you look at making them a little more flexible, we are not an entitlement community, as I'm sure perhaps the community that you're mentioning is not either. So we have to compete for funding from some of our smaller communities in Montana. And if we were able to have a little more flexibility in that program, a little more funding in that program, I think it would help a lot to aid in the infrastructure decisions that we are making.
Thank you so much, Mayor Andrus. With my remaining time, please, Mayor Woods. Tempe is making big strides in clean energy, and congratulations to you for the investments that you're making in renewable energy infrastructure, which creates jobs and helps us sustain our natural habitat. In Southwest Georgia, including areas of the state like Albany, Valdosta, Bainbridge, and Thomasville, we're also uniquely positioned to take advantage of opportunities in solar energy production, given our location and the infrastructure that already exists there. Can you please reflect, Mayor Woods, based on your experience, on how Southwest Georgia, given the assets that we have, might benefit economically from increased investment in clean energy, as you have made such investments in and around Tempe?
Absolutely, Senator Also. Thank you for the question. So energy use accounts for about 70% of our municipal carbon emissions and about 50% of our community investments. We have actually 6 municipal buildings here in the city of Tempe with solar on them right now to minimize municipal carbon emissions. And so one of our big priorities is working on these sort of resiliency hubs with our local electric companies, Arizona Public Service, Salt River Project. These hubs really do demonstrate how solar and battery storage can be used in the case of extreme heat and temperatures. And right now, today is a 118-degree day right here in Arizona. So the fact that we're studying the use of these resiliency hubs is huge and really will help to protect us when there are issues when it comes to extreme heat. So funding that really helps to continue to prioritize this kind of work when it comes to solar for the purpose of creating environmental sustainability and reducing emissions is huge for the city of Tempe and for the entire region.
Thank you, Mayor Woods. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Is no one else, I believe no one else is in the queue for questions? Senator Toomey, I don't know if you have anything else. I think that you are not in the queue, so thank you. Thanks to all of you for being, all five of you for being here today. We've heard from mayors across the country that they and their citizens are doing all they can to serve their communities, to create places where families and communities and businesses can flourish. We've heard from these local officials that they are doing all they can, but that they need help from the federal government to build the infrastructure of the 21st century. And decidedly, that includes housing and transit in that infrastructure. It doesn't matter if you're in the industrial Midwest or surrounded by the Rocky Mountains or a booming community in the Southwest. Federal help has played in the past and needs to play an essential role in supporting communities in the private sector and allowing our workers and businesses to compete around the world. My friend John Tester, I think, summed it up when he said, we can either get serious about this or we can turn the keys over to China. Thanks to our witnesses. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, these questions are due by the close of business Tuesday, June 22nd. For our witnesses, please submit your responses to those questions for the record 45 days from today. Thank you all for being here. The meeting is adjourned.